What's going on, everyone? It's Elias here at the Rainy Forge, back with another video. I've got an awesome little project I'm working on today, so let's jump right in. Alright, so what we're working on today. A really good buddy of mine finally decided he wanted to order a knife from me, and he wants to make a nice Damascus knife. Now, the shape that we're looking at is going to be something along these lines. And I had him over and he wasn't sure what he wanted, and I had him looking through all my knives, and he picked this one out, which is still up on my website and over on my Etsy if you have any interest. And he really liked the shape and design of this knife, although he wants the handle to be just a little bit longer. So we're going to make sure that the handle's a little bit longer in the final knife. But that is the general shape that we are following. And the other thing that is really interesting about this knife is we are going to be using this pair of old scissors in the construction. Now these belong to, I believe it was his mother, and they're very sentimental to him, and he wanted me to incorporate them into the knife build. And so what we're going to have to do with these is, since they are either stainless, I believe they're probably stainless, or just a mild high carbon steel, we want to make sure that we include these on the outside of our knife and not the inside, so we don't have any issues with the structure of the knife or with having softer steel on the blade. So the first thing that we have to do with these is we're going to heat them up in the forge and forge them flat so we have some workable steel that we can use in our billet. The other thing that we're going to have to do is chop up some steel, some 1095 and 15 and 20, make a nice little sandwich billet that we can forge out and fold over. And we're going to be doing a raindrop pattern on this Damascus billet, and once we get to that point I'll show you how we go ahead and do that. But for now, let's get the forge rocking and rolling, and we'll heat these scissors up and flatten them up so we can work with them. First thing I'm trying to do here is I'm going to try and get this screw out of here. Not sure exactly how I'm going to do that, but we're just going to start flattening. Hopefully be able to break this loose. Alright, I got them separated. So now we're just going to flatten these out to a nice uniform. Alright, I've got these nice and flat, and I'm just going to let them cool down, and we'll grind them clean and get that billet prepped. Alright, so now that I've gone ahead and flattened out our scissors, we're going to go ahead and set these aside and work on our billet. Now I have here 15 and 20 and 1095 for our billet. It is very important that you use 15 and 20 in a Damascus billet so that when you go to do the acid etch, the 15 and 20 stays shiny and isn't as affected by the acid, so you have a nice contrast in your final pattern. Now, another thing that I like to do, if you've seen any of my other Damascus videos, is I will go ahead on one of my steels and just put a little dog ear on the corners. And that's just in case something happens and I should drop all my steel. I know what's what, and I don't have to worry about stacking the same steel on top of itself, which will ruin the pattern. So just a little trick for you guys. The other thing that's very important whenever you're doing a Damascus billet, make sure all of your steel is nice and clean before you go and weld this together. Make sure there are no oils or debris or anything in between your steel, and that just helps to ensure a really good solid forge weld with no delams or any other nonsense going on. So now that I have this billet all set to go, we'll hop out into the forge and get this thing welded up. So pretty nice and easy. All we got to do is do a tack on each corner, and then I've also got my handle here, which we're going to weld on the end. Gives us something to hold on to, so we can fully heat the billet up in the forge. So now that I have my billet welded up, it's very important that you take either some WD-40 or kerosene and coat the outside of the billet. Now what this does is your fluid, using what's called capillary action, will get pulled into the billet in between the layers, and that helps keep your steel clean so no oxides form as it's heating up in the forge. Now I use WD-40 because that's what I'm able to get, but you can also use kerosene. You just get a big container of kerosene and dunk your billet in the kerosene. And I just find years and years of doing forge welds, this helps so much in ensuring that you get a nice solid forge weld before your steel is heated up enough to use borax. Now borax is what we use as we're forging the knife. I've got my big box right here. And that acts as a flux, and that will keep the steel clean again as we're heating it up to make sure that no oxides form in between our layers, which helps us get a nice solid forge weld with no delams or pockets. So we'll get the fire going and get everything heated up, get this billet in there and start hammering. So now that I've got my forge weld set, I'm going to use the cross on the cross peen hammer to go ahead and draw this billet out as flat as I can. Now that I've got my billet nice and flat, scrub off each crack on the surface. And we're going to attempt to fold this billet over Probably lose my handle here. Sucks. Try and not lose the handle. We're going to put a little bit of flux on here to keep it clean. Back in the forge. There we go. Now just grab my brush. I don't know where my brush went. Oh, there it is. Grab my brush and just, again, try and clean off any crap that's in here so this forge weld's nice and good. Put a little bit more flux in there, right in the crack. Close this up. Now we got to get this nice and hot to try and set that forge weld. Now it's very important that when we get it hot enough and set the weld that we start hammering right here and work our way back, and that will push out any flux or crap that's in the middle there. Make sure we have a solid forge weld. Put a little bit more flux in here. Give it a little bit more right up here. Try and get that spot heated. Alright, now that we've got our billet nice and flat, just make sure everything's super flat. No big hammer marks. Just about losing my handle here, but that's fine. We're just about done. Heat it up one more time. Make sure everything's nice and clean. Make sure all my forge welds are good. And then we'll let this cool down and put our raindrop pattern in it. So here's our billet out of the forge, nice and annealed. And it's actually been a couple days. I had my grinder finally kick the bucket on me, so I had to order a new one. She's back there, and you'll see her in a minute. What we're going to have to do here next is we're going to grind one face of this billet nice and clean. The other side doesn't matter because we're actually going to be drilling into it to create our raindrop pattern. So we only need one face clean when we go to forge weld our second step, which is going to be this billet split in half and a little bit more steel added in the center to make sure that we have enough for our final knife. But like I said, first thing, we're going to grind this face clean and then start drilling into the other face. So now that I have this side all nice and cleaned up, we're going to go ahead and just drill some holes on this side to make our raindrop pattern. Now the general idea is you want to get down through the first layer for sure, and if you can, the second layer of steel as well when you drill your holes, and that will make sure that you have a really nice contrast with your lights and your darks when we acid etch later on, so you can really see that pattern. Now I will do various sized drill bits when I'm doing my pattern. You can do the same size, it really doesn't matter. I recommend not going super small with your drill bits. The larger they are, the better chance you have of getting a nice pattern to an extent. If you go too large of a drill bit, later on when we go and forge everything flat, you'll lose a lot of those nice little circular patterns and things will get a little bit more egg-shaped and oblong. So kind of a medium-sized drill bit is best. And like I said, we're just going to go and do a bunch of holes over this entire drill. So there's our Swiss cheese, and the next step we're going to cut this in half so we can restack it. So here's our new billet. I've got a little piece of 1095 in the center. If you remember, our outside of our steel is 15 and 20, so we want to make sure that that extra piece that we add is going to contrast. So now we're going to weld this up, throw our handle on there, stick it back in the forge, and flatten it out. Now that I've got my forge weld set, we're going to start drawing this billet out using the horn handle here. And as I go, I think I'm going to open it up. Like I got a little pocket here. So we're just going to throw some flux on there and heat it up and flatten it out and hopefully get that to forge weld. Alright, I got that little bit to close, which is good. Usually as long as you haven't overheated your steel, basically as long as you haven't gotten it to the point where it starts sparking, you can close any cold shuts. A little bit of flux, just heat it up. So now what we're trying to do here is we're trying to get to this thickness so I can add some more steel to this billet when we go to forge out the final knife. So as you can see, this is where we're at. So I got to draw this billet out a little bit more, make it a little bit thinner. Alright, so I've got this to the right thickness. I'm just going to straighten out all the sides, make sure everything's nice and flat. And then we're going to stick it in the forge, heat it up, and let it cool down slowly so everything's nice and annealed, and we can grind both sides nice and easily. So here's our billet out of the forge, and the next step is to again grind both faces nice and clean so we can forge weld a little bit more steel onto here. So I make sure I have enough when I draw the blade out. As of right now, I have definitely enough for the handle and just a little bit of the blade. So we definitely want to add some more steel to this billet, and that's how we do it. So we'll get grinding. Alright, so I have my billet, and I actually have two more pieces of 15 and 20 here. Now, if you'll remember, the outside of our billet is 15 and 20, so you might be thinking, well, why would we want to do 15 and 20 as our extra steel? That'll just make a really thick layer of 15 and 20. Now, because our outer layer here of 15 and 20 actually has that raindrop Damascus pattern in there, I can put the 15 and 20 on here on the outside, and it's not going to really mess anything up. In addition to that, we have to add our scissors on top of this billet eventually, and I did some testing, and the scissors do turn black in my coffee bath solution, whereas the 15 and 20 does not. So I need to make sure that those scissors on the outside are sitting on top of 15 and 20 so I get the nice contrast going on. Now, I also don't want to forge weld my scissors on just yet, because as I draw this blade out, that little bit of steel on the top will get drawn out way too much, and we're going to kind of lose that accent, and that's the whole point of this knife, to have that as the accent piece. So for now, all we're going to do is pop this billet into the forge, get everything nice and forge welded, and then start to draw that blade out so we can go back through, grind it clean, and forge weld the scissors on there. So now that my forge welds are set, I can start drawing the blade out using the horn of the anvil. So it's important for the first couple of hits to keep your billet at forge welding temperatures. Just go slow. And if you see anything open up, throw some flux in there, get it hot enough again, and then forge it flat. Got just a little tiny bit right there that's opening up, so we'll just put a tiny bit of flux right on there, not too much. Get it hot and flatten it out. just going to keep working this billet until I get to the right length. Once again, here is our kind of template knife. So we're getting there, but I want that billet to be just about the full length of the knife, and then we're going to forge out the tip. Alright, so I got the length to about where I want it, and the next thing we're going to do is start forging out that tip. Now what we want to do here is get it on the horn of the anvil on both sides, flatten it, and what we're looking for here is we want a little bit of a bump in the front so we don't get fish lips when we go to forge out the tip. So you can see we're starting to get it here. Just a little bit of a curve. And I want to make sure I keep this at forge welding temperatures just in case there's any cold shuts. You can go ahead and close those as we're forging. Just about there. I want to just give it a little bit of a curve here on top, and the rest of this blade, the clip point and everything, we're going to grind out that profile later on. A little curve on top, and the other thing that we have to do before we let this blade anneal is we're going to forge in the little groove for the handle down here. So we're just going to heat that up, and again use the horn of the anvil and just knock that in. So I've got that nice handle groove going on, and I'm just going to clean everything up and flatten it out. Got a nice back curve going on it. And my length is just about where I want it. We're going to forge it out a little bit more when we add those scissors. And we might actually forge the blade out bevel when we go to do that as well. But for now, just flatten everything out nice. Make it so we can grind it easy. And then we're going to stick this knife back into the forge and let it anneal. So here's our knife, all nice and annealed and ready to grind. And I have my scissors all cleaned up. So those are just going to be forge welded on the top like this. We're going to go ahead and just tack weld these on here so they stay while I have them in the forge heating up. And then just flatten everything up and hopefully get it to forge weld nice. And the only way we're going to do that is to clean up both faces of this knife. Luckily I don't have to do the whole thing, just where the scissors are going to be. But it's a good 7-inch section of knife. So we're just going to throw it on the grinder and get it cleaned up. there we have it, all nice and clean. So now I'm just going to go out and tack weld my scissors on real quick, and I'll see you guys in the forge. So first thing I'm going to do is just kind of set this flat. And it might start forge welding, which is good, but we're just kind of flattening it right now. Get it so it's nice and flush. I still got plenty of flux on there. So back in the forge and set that weld. So now that we've got this forge welded on here, we're just going to keep it hot and just keep it clean. Get my brush, clean off any oxides. Just keep some flux on here. Just heat it up, and I'm just going to keep working it flat. And I'll get back with you guys in a little bit. So here's our knife, and I've got kind of the template knife here. We stretch that handle out a bit, and we've got that shape fairly close. We're just going to be grinding out the full profile, but I've got the width where I need it, and to the point where I can grind it how I want to grind it. And we're going to leave everything nice and rough in the final knife as requested. And I think she's going to turn out pretty sweet. So back in the forge she goes to cool down and anneal, so it makes it nice and easy to grind out that bevel and drill our holes for pins. So here's our knife out of the forge, and the first thing we got to do is clean off all this forge scale so I don't break down my grinder belt super fast. So the next two things we got to do is we're going to put some jimping on the spine for grip, and then we also got to drill our pins for the handle. So we have our knife here with our pinholes drilled, and this is ready to go out to heat treatment. But before we do that, I want to get my handle material prepped. So what we're doing with the handle of this knife is we're going to be using cherry as our main handle material with a little band in the back, just like on our template knife here. And we're going to be making that with this gorgeous blue acrylic, which I believe I got from Texas Knife Maker Supply over on Etsy. Absolutely stunning acrylic. And then I also have a little piece of Kydex that we're going to be cutting up and using as our two outside pieces for our center band. And that just kind of breaks things up and makes that little center piece really stand out and pop. So pretty straightforward. I've got my cherry. I've got the length of cherry I want. You always want to make sure that you cut extra handle material than what you actually need, just in case. It is always easier to remove excess material than it is to add more. So I just always make sure I have more than enough to begin with. And then once we cut this out, I've got marked the width of our handle material. So we're going to be getting rid of this top little bit and keeping the bottom section. And then I've just got to cut my acrylic to size, cut my Kydex to size, epoxy everything together, and let it rest. And that gives me enough time to go ahead, heat treat the knife, clean it up, do all the acid etch while that's sitting and resting. So first things first, we'll cut out our cherry, cut out our acrylic, cut out our Kydex, and I'll get back with you. So here's all of our pieces put together, and the next thing we're going to do is just epoxy everything together and let it sit and rest, and then take our knife out to the forge and get it heat treated. Now if you have clamps, you can clamp up your handle scales there. I have clamps, but I find that usually they just kind of make everything wiggle around. I don't have really nice Jorgensen woodworking clamps, so I usually just glue it and let it sit. You know, kind of pinch it tight and just let it sit, and I haven't had any issues so far. Also, when you're making knives, you have that added benefit of your handle scales being glued onto your handle and having pins to hold everything together so nothing breaks apart. But if you're doing like a cutting board or something where you don't have that, it's important that you use really, really good epoxy and clamp everything together nice and tight. But I'm not really a woodworker. I'm a knife maker. I do handles, and this is how I do them. And I don't need to use clamps. Just glue everything together. So, just a quick tip for you guys. And let's pop out to the forge. So I have the knife here nice and polished, and so I took this to 400 grit on my grinder and then hit it on my buffing wheel. Now when you're doing Damascus, you don't really have to do a whole lot more than that. Once we do the acid etch and we go into our instant coffee bath to turn the knife black, it really doesn't matter the polished areas if they're up to 800 grit or 1000 grit or 1500 grit or whatever you usually go to with the blade. And the reason for that is with the contrast, you're really not going to see any of those little micro scratches and whatnot. And a lot of that gets taken care of in the initial acid bath that we do here anyway. So it's really up to you as a knife maker if you want to go that extra mile and get her like mirror polished. That's up to you. Right now I can see my reflection in the knife. It's mirror polished enough for me. So that's just what I like to do. You can do whatever you'd like to do with your knives. But as someone who does this for a living and has to make money, that saves about 20 to 30 minutes of extra polishing work. Now the other thing that I want to talk about that's very important here is when you go and use a buffing wheel to buff out your knife and make it nice and shiny, there is buffing compound on your buffing wheel, and now that buffing compound gets on your blade after you hit it on the buffing wheel. I know, obvious, but needs to be said, because when you then dip your knife in your acid, if you have not cleaned off that compound on your blade, you will interrupt your acid etch and you'll get streaks and you'll get fingerprints and you'll get all sorts of crap that you don't want on your knife, acid etched into the knife. So it's very important to save yourself some time and headache that you make sure and clean off your blade thoroughly after hitting it on the buffing wheel before you go into an acid etch. With that being said, I've done all of that here, and now we're going to dip it in our ferric chloride for about 7 seconds or so, and that will just give our nice initial acid etch. And we're actually going to repeat this process one more time after this to make sure that we've got a good solid deep etch and that our pattern really pops and we're able to really have a nice contrast on the knife. So I'm just going to let a little bit of this acid drip off here so I don't get it everywhere, and then I'll show you guys kind of how this blade's looking here. So you can see that pattern on there. These big circles here, that's left over from our welding our scissors on there. And normally you could chase after that if you don't want that on there, but I'm going to leave it on there because I think it looks really cool, and it's going to offer a nice contrast in the final product. So I'm going to go ahead and wash this acid off, and then we're going to clean off any remaining oxides with some rubbing compound. So now that I have all the acid cleaned off the knife, we're going to use our number 7 heavy duty rubbing compound. You guys have seen me use this before many times. Nice and simple. We just have a little bit of shop cloth, take a little bit of that rubbing compound and just rub down the knife, clean off all those oxides so that we can then take the knife over to my buffing wheel and get it nice and polished again before the instant coffee bath. So there we have it. I'll go and polish the knife up, and then I'm going to dip it in acid one more time to make sure that we get a really good etch on our pattern. And that way it just helps the oxides that we get from our instant coffee bath, it helps them to stay on the knife and not wear off as easily if the crevices and grooves of the pattern are a little bit deeper. So that's why I do the acid bath twice before the instant coffee bath. So like I said, I'm going to go polish this up, and I'll be back with you in just a second. So here we are. Knife is nice and shiny again. And so for those of you that aren't familiar, I'll go through this really quick. We are using Nescafe Classico instant coffee. You can use other instant coffees, but this is the best stuff. This is what most knife makers use to get the best results, and so this is what I use. Now I currently have about half of this mixed into here, and we want to make sure that we're using distilled water or spring water when we do an instant coffee etch. Now the reason for that is our tap water here in America has a lot of fluoride and chlorine in it. If you weren't familiar with that concept, yeah, it's awesome. Our government's great. So the fluoride and the chlorine in our tap water actually acts to neutralize the acid in the instant coffee, which is what we need to make sure that we have nice black oxides on our knife. So it's very important that you used either distilled water or spring water that doesn't have the fluoride and the chlorine in it to get proper results. Now the other important thing is we want to heat up our instant coffee solution. Not super hot, usually only about 90 to 100 degrees. If you get it too hot, you lose a lot of that acidity and you won't get a good etch. And if it's too cold, you'll get a good etch, but it's going to take a couple days versus a couple hours. So it's important that you get it a little bit warm before you start. Now again, you can do it cold. I've done it cold many times. It just takes a couple days versus a couple hours. So now that I have everything prepped, I'll take my knife and I'll dunk it in my instant coffee solution. Just give it a little bit of a stir around, lift it in and out of the solution a couple times to make sure the whole blade gets nice and coated. So basically it's the same concept of when you're doing a quench in oil. There will be little tiny miniature air bubbles and whatnot on your blade as you dunk it into any fluid or solution, and you want to just make sure that you kind of move the blade around, lift it in and out, make sure to break up any of those little air bubbles and make sure that the whole surface is completely coated with your instant coffee solution, or if you're quenching in oil, and that way you don't have soft spots on the blade. So just a little quick tip for you guys, and we're just going to let this knife sit in here for a couple hours, and once she's good and done, I'll show you how she's looking, and we'll slap the handle on her. Alright, so it's been a couple hours, and here is our blade. Nice and blackened. Those beautiful shiny clad lines where the 15 and 20 is. And the next step that we got to do is get the handle glued on. So I've got my block here. The epoxy has hardened nicely. So now all we got to do is drill some holes and cut out our scales. But, you know, for the sake of editing. So there we have our handle scales, and we'll go ahead and glue them onto our knife, and then start grinding the handle down and shaping it. So there's our handle, nice and polished. And I'm just going to go ahead and throw a nice shaving sharp edge on this knife, and we'll show off the finished product. Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked this video, please go ahead and hit that big like button down below. And while you're down there, if you're not already subscribed to this channel, well, why don't you go ahead and hit that big subscribe button as well. Links in the description below to all of my social media, as well as my Etsy and website, where you can either order something that I already have made, or put in a nice custom badass blade. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, keep on keeping on.